The old costume room of the Majestic Theater has been sealed for over 30 years. They say that every Halloween night, the forgotten costumes hang themselves back in place, even though the door remains locked. And when the lights flicker on, the mirror shows more than just their reflection. The Majestic Theater stood at the heart of a small southern Ohio town, where the old streets still glowed under the same dim yellow lamps from the 70s. In its golden years, it was the pride of the town, the stage for plays, masquerades, and the annual Halloween gala. The scent of stage fabric, grease paint, and jazz from aging speakers once filled the air like the theater's very soul. Every October, crowds would line the block to see Masquerade of Souls, a production written and performed entirely by the Majestic's own troupe. On the night of October 31st, 1985, the auditorium was packed. Scarlet ribbons hung from the ceiling, and yellow light filtered through the haze of stage smoke, creating an otherworldly shimmer. Behind the curtains, the costume room buzzed with activity. Dozens of outfits were being hung, mended, and dried. Velvet, lace, and imitation leather tangled together, each tagged with a performer's name stitched in silver thread. In the corner, a large mirror, coated with a thin layer of dust, reflected their movements, sometimes a fraction out of sync, as if the images lagged behind the living. At 8:47 p.m., the first flame appeared. A stagehand later claimed to have seen a dress moving on its own before it burst into fire, as though someone invisible had slipped it on. Within minutes, the room became an inferno. The hiss of burning fabric mingled with the groan of melting metal. Some tried to flee, but the mirror flared suddenly, its light disorienting them, pulling them backward, as if the reflection refused to let them go. By the time firefighters arrived, the blaze had consumed the back of the theater. 17 people perished, actors, crew, and several from the front rows. Among them was Eleanor Shaw, the lead actress once praised for having eyes that could hypnotize an audience. Her body was never recovered. After the fire, the authorities sealed the Majestic. The seats were torn out, the marquee removed, yet the costume room remained untouched, locked behind an iron door. Locals whispered that every Halloween night, the windows of that room flickered faintly, like the theater lights of old. The wind carried the scent of scorched fabric, and sometimes a fragment of the Masquerade of Souls soundtrack could be heard drifting through the empty halls, though the power had long been cut. More than 30 years have passed, and the Majestic still stands, paint peeling, its golden letters fading to rust. Yet, through the fogged glass, shadows still move inside. Some swear the hanging costumes seem fuller now, as if something within them waits for the next performance. 30 years after the fire, Martha Cole returned to the Majestic Theater. Her silver hair and time-worn hands had once been the pride of the troupe, the costumer who knew every scene, every stitch, every whisper of fabric that graced the stage. Now she had come back at the request of the Restoration Committee, tasked with cataloging what remained before renovations began. The road to the theater was unchanged, only quieter. The Majestic's facade was blanketed in dust, its decaying curtains stirring faintly in the autumn breeze. Martha stopped before the rusted iron doors, still marked with the blackened imprint of a hand, as though someone had tried to push through the fire itself. When she turned the old key, the metal groaned sharply, the sound dragging out like a breath that had been held for 30 years. Inside, the air was cold and heavy with the scent of damp ash. Under the dim light filtering through cracked windows, motes of dust drifted like unspent cinders. The rotted floorboards creaked beneath her steps. On the walls still hung the old cast photos, faces frozen in their final glow. At the center stood Eleanor Shaw, her eyes fixed on the camera, piercing through decades, as if watching whoever dared to return. Martha followed the corridor toward the costume room. The door was still locked, though the corroded latch gave way with only a gentle push. The smell that rushed out was thick and layered: perfume, hairspray, burnt fabric, and the ghost of long-settled smoke. Inside, time had stopped. A few charred costumes still hung on their racks, edges stiffened as if the fire had paused mid-consumption. The light slanting through the doorway brushed across the black velvet, making the folds seem to breathe. She approached the large mirror in the corner, the same one she used to polish before every performance. Its surface was veiled with a dense film of dust, turning reflections into vague silhouettes. Martha wiped a section clear. The room in the mirror appeared sharper, but lit differently. There, behind her, the racks held more costumes than existed in the room. Each shadowed garment stood upright, puffed, full, as if occupied. Martha stepped back, her gaze darting between reflection and reality. Only a few burnt costumes hung crooked in truth, yet in the mirror, every outfit gleamed, pristine and waiting. A sudden draft stirred the curtains, whispering through the silence. When she turned again, all was still. All but one thing. The measuring tape she always kept in her coat pocket was gone. It now lay neatly coiled on the vanity table, placed with deliberate care, as if by familiar hands. On the mirror's surface, the silver stitches of the costumes glimmered faintly, like old stage lights flickering back to life after 30 years of sleep. Nisses. The afternoon light thinned through the dusty window pane. The last rays of the day slanted across the row of tall mirrors, stretching long, murky shadows over the cracked wooden floor. Martha Cole stood motionless, her eyes narrowing slightly. She had thought she was used to the silence of the old theater. Yet here, inside the costume room, silence seemed to have weight. It stood in the air, thick and trembling with every breath she took. She wiped the mirror again, widening each circle of her cloth until the reflection emerged in full. In that moment, something felt wrong. Her shadow did not align with her posture. It leaned slightly to one side, as if the light behind her had shifted. But there was no other light source. When she bent down to pick up the cloth she had dropped, her reflection did not follow. The figure in the mirror remained upright. A faint breeze slipped through a crack in the door, making the tattered ribbons hanging from the ceiling sway. Martha turned, then faced the mirror again. In the reflection, the costumes behind her no longer appeared burned or wrinkled. The fabric was smooth, luminous, alive. One black velvet dress stood out among the rest, Eleanor Shaw's gown. The hem still bore a faint burn mark, yet the bodice rose and fell softly, as if someone inside were breathing. There was no wind, and yet the dress moved, slowly, rhythmically, like a body standing perfectly still while its lungs filled and emptied. Light shimmered faintly along the edges of the velvet, giving the illusion of flesh shifting beneath the fabric. Martha stared, her throat dry and tight. Then the shadow in the mirror tilted its head, just slightly. A motion that was not her own. On the wall, the old clock struck 6. Each chime rasped through the room, stretching out like a dying breath. With every toll, the light warped, half real, half reflected. And in that flickering distortion, Martha saw she was no longer alone. Behind her in the mirror stood a row of figures dressed in costume, their faces blurred, outlined only in pale chalk like stage makeup. They stood side by side, heads bowed as though waiting for their cue. She spun around. The room was empty, only the scorched, lifeless costumes hanging in stillness. But in the mirror, the troupe remained. One figure slowly raised her head. Her eyes glowed, pupils spreading like smoke. She stepped forward, and the surface of the mirror rippled. No longer glass, but a pool of dark water opening outward. Martha stumbled back, her hand striking the vanity's edge. A puff of old powder burst into the air like ash. She saw them clearly now, every face she remembered from the 1985 cast, each marked by the fire. Blistered hands, cracked cheeks, makeup melted into skin. They weren't looking at her. They were looking past her, toward the open doorway behind. Then came the rustle of fabric. A coat slipped from its hanger, then slowly lifted, returning neatly to its place. Next came the dresses, the masks, one by one. Each moved as if unseen hands were preparing them for the show to come. The air turned icy. From somewhere deep within the walls, faint music rose, the warped overture of Masquerade of Souls dragging its notes through the dark. Martha's gaze returned to the mirror. Only one figure remained now, Eleanor Shaw, draped in her black velvet gown, her lips curling into a faint smile. But when Martha turned, no one was there. Only the dress, hanging in midair, swaying gently, as though bowing to an invisible audience. Night fell faster than it should have. Outside, the autumn wind tore across the theater's decaying roof, whistling like overstretched strings. Martha Cole remained where she stood, in the darkened costume room, lit only by the flicker of the old ceiling bulbs, a sickly yellow glow that seemed to come from nowhere. She felt the cold seep into her skin, along with a familiar scent spreading through the air, the mingled perfume of burnt cloth and old stage powder. The room was changing. It no longer looked abandoned, but alive, like the backstage of a performance about to begin. The costumes were no longer scorched or covered in dust. They gleamed under the trembling light, straightened, flawless, freshly pressed after decades of silence. From somewhere beyond the door came the slow rasp of stage curtains being drawn. A red glow from the auditorium spilled through the crack, cutting a narrow line across the floor. Martha stepped forward. Her shadow stretched long, merging with others, faint human shapes drifting around her in the dimness. With every step she took, the creak of the floorboards echoed as if many footsteps followed her. The door to the stage hung slightly ajar. Before her eyes, the Majestic Theater had come alive again. Seats restored, chandeliers blazing, crimson drapes new and full, the orchestra pit shimmering in the corner. Nothing bore the mark of the fire. And yet the auditorium was empty. No audience, no voices. Only the slow, hollow swell of music rising from nowhere, the haunting melody of Masquerade of Souls. At the center of the stage stood figures of smoke, the cast of 1985. Each was rimmed in a faint aura of flame, glowing like embers refusing to die. Martha recognized them one by one. The makeup artist, the musician, and finally Eleanor Shaw, radiant in her black velvet gown, her outline shimmering like living coal. They began to move. A silent performance, only music and light. From the wings, Martha watched, her hands trembling as she realized she was among them. A younger version of herself stood there, dressed in the costumer's uniform, waiting beside the mirror for her cue. Then, Just as before, the first flame bloomed at the edge of the curtain, small as a breath, then spreading, crawling along the stage floor like a glowing thread. A pop echoed from above. Everything unfolded exactly as it had that night. Not a single moment out of place. The fire snaked through the rows of seats, circled the orchestra, then crept toward the backstage, toward her. Martha tried to step back, but her feet would not move. The floor clung to her, heavy, unyielding. In the mirror at the far end of the room, the fire burned brighter, wilder, as if the glass itself were aflame. Inside it, she saw her past self, the costumer from 1985, standing amid the blaze. Her face held no fear, only anticipation. Light met light. The boundary between past and present dissolved. Martha felt her body grow lighter, warmth slipping from her limbs like sand. The smoke around her thickened, yet it didn't choke. It was soft, almost tender, like a curtain drawing to a close. When the flames touched the mirror, the images fused, reflection and reality becoming one. Amid the fire, the figures began to bow. Each motion stirred a cloud of ash that drifted upward, glittering like silver dust across the stage. Martha stood among them, staring out at the empty rows of seats. No audience remained, yet faint applause echoed in the dark, distant and hollow, perhaps from memory, or from the other side of the glass. Then, silence. The flames vanished, leaving behind a darkness deep and velvety. In that blackness, something moved. A faint rustle of fabric, a slow, steady breath from those who no longer live. The performance was over. But somewhere, deep within the Majestic, the sound of curtains being drawn rose once more, signaling that another show was about to begin. The next morning, the Ohio sun rose through a curtain of thick gray fog. Its faint light fell upon the Majestic Theater, silent, lifeless, like an ancient corpse preserved in dust. The iron doors were still locked, untouched, yet from the narrow crack beneath, a weak yellow glow flickered from within. The theater's power had been cut off for years, and still, that light pulsed softly, like the last breath of an oil lamp refusing to die. When the restoration crew arrived, they found the entrance layered with fine ash. Inside, the auditorium looked strangely orderly. The decayed seats, once shredded and rotting, had been cleaned bare. At the center of the stage, the red curtain was drawn open, smooth, perfect, almost wet with a dark sheen under the dim morning light. The dressing room door was slightly ajar. A faint mixture of old powder, perfume, and the smoky scent of something once burned lingered in the air. On the clothing rack, the charred costumes from the night before were gone. In their place hung a single gown, black velvet, exquisitely tailored, untouched by fire. Its size fit a woman in her late 50s. Embroidered in fine silver thread along the collar was a name, Martha Cole. On the vanity lay a measuring tape, neatly coiled, just as Martha used to leave it after every show. The mirror above it was fogged with a thin and pale mist, but within its reflection, the room appeared different. No longer empty, no longer silent. Instead, it showed the Majestic's grand stage in full light, its seats restored, the chandeliers blazing. At the center of that reflected stage stood a woman in a flowing black gown, bowing deeply, her long hair swaying like smoke. The gesture was graceful, practiced, the final bow of a show long since ended. In reality, the room was still, but inside the mirror, the stage lights dimmed one by one until only a single spotlight remained, fixed on the woman's figure. As it faded, everything within the glass dissolved into darkness. Then came the faint sound of applause, slow, deliberate, distant, echoing from deep within the auditorium. It sounded like the clapping of a lone spectator, or perhaps from the other side of the mirror. That afternoon, the Majestic Theater was sealed again, for safety reasons. The incident was never mentioned in the news. Only a few workers spoke quietly of what they'd seen. The lingering glow inside, the soft hum of music, as if someone were rehearsing an old act that refused to end. A year later, on Halloween night, the lights inside the locked theater flickered to life once more. The red curtain parted slightly. Music rose from within, warped, hollow, drifting through the fog. And then, a single figure stepped into the spotlight. A woman in a black velvet gown. She bowed deeply to an invisible audience. There was no one inside the Majestic Theater. Yet the sound of applause went on and on, echoing through the night without end. Nanda.